So glad that you brought up the Great Divergence, which I think Karl Polanyi would have called the Great Transformation. One of the things that's central for Karl Polanyi in thinking about the Great Transformation is, of course, the machine and the place of the sort of the factory that emerges around the machine as part of the 19th century economic order. So today, I guess what I'm interested in thinking about is, instead of taking us forward, maybe taking us back to the 19th century to think about sort of some of the changes in sort of the economic order, particularly within the European context and its relationship to thinking about science and economics together. So we've sort of been thinking about politics and economics, and I'd like to sort of bring science into the conversation. In The Republic of Science, which was published in Minerva in 1962, Michael Polanyi sketches an image of how knowledge is produced. In Polanyi's view, the community of science bears a resemblance to economic principles that regulate the productions of goods for markets. Two principles that guide Polanyi's vision for the Republic of Science are the absence of a centralized authority and the significance of tradition and autonomy in the individual scientist's pursuit of knowledge. It is up to the individual scientists, rather than centralized planners, to determine where best to devote their cognitive energy. Thus, the Republic of Science is imagined as a community of individual intellectual workers with limited cognitive resources to spend on problem solving. Their work depends upon engaging with tradition, but also breaking from that tradition when they're confronted with certain kinds of problems. So I think the central political problem of liberalism, as articulated by people like John Stuart Mill, how individual autonomy is preserved against a kind of backdrop of social tradition, for Polanyi is equally sort of central to the problem of knowledge. And so scientific knowledge, in Polanyi's view, is not held together in an individual's mind, but is split into thousands of fragments, as he says. It's held by a multitude of individuals, each of whom endorses the other's opinion at second hand. And so in this paper, I guess I'd like to situate Polanyi's view within a longer history of thinking about images of knowledge production, so sort of going back to Adam Smith. So I think that one of the things that an image of the 19th century is that machines are sort of just imagined as sort of displacing manual labor, and it's sort of not until the 20th century where we have machines kind of also perhaps displacing intellectual labor. But the question of intellectual labor and its relationship to machines was sort of central to most important economic theorists of the 19th century. If we go back to Smith, Smith draws our attention to how the division of labor, for instance, affects the philosopher, which I think he has in mind, sort of natural philosopher, man of science, more generally, mostly men at this point. So Smith says, in the progress of society, philosophy or speculation becomes like every other employment, the principal or sole trade and occupation of a particular class of citizens. Like every other employment, too, it is subdivided into a great number of branches, each of which affords occupation to a particular tribe or class of philosophers. And this subdivision of employment in philosophy, as well as in every other business, improves dexterity and saves time. So we can kind of think of this as, if we take Smith's example of the pins and sort of extend it to what's going on with the mind, that's kind of sort of what he's imagining here. But Smith doesn't really elaborate on what this might actually look like, at least as far as I found in his works. I think if we turn instead to Charles Babbage, he gives us a sort of a much broader sense of what this might look like. Writing in the 1830s, Babbage extends Smith's account of the division of manual labor to intellectual work. In Babbage's view, the increasing sophistication of production of knowledge required that mental labor be organized according to different degrees of skill in a hierarchy of work. As Simon Schaffer has shown, Babbage found inspiration for this view of work in a French mathematician, Gaspard de Prony. So Prony demonstrated in his production of logarithmic tables in revolutionary France, which is this kind of large monument to the revolution and the central place of calculation in the sort of new revolutionary regime, which Lorraine Daston has written about. And so for Babbage, Prony shows how a large parcel of mental work might be reducible or representable as a kind of handwork. So Prony parceled his mental workers into three strata. At the top of the pyramid were management-oriented savants who kind of organized this calculating system. And so according to Babbage, Prony would have been one of these intellectuals. The second class required training in analysis and the ability to solve sort of simple problems. And the third class was a kind of number crunching class. So this, ideally, they sort of, Babbage says that the work that they're doing is so based it might even be deemed mechanical. And so Babbage imagined a sort of, and also worked throughout his life on trying to build a calculating machine that indeed would replace this kind of labor. And so, as Babbage notes, it is remarkable that 9/10 of this class had no knowledge of arithmetic beyond its two first rules, which they thus called upon to exercise. And these persons were usually found more correct in their calculations than those who possessed a more extensive knowledge of the subject. So it wasn't just that you're saving money by having these knowledgeless workers be in this position. They're actually better at it because they're not sort of distracted by sort of maybe flights of the imagination or something like this. So for Babbage, the overall process would thus be more efficient if savants steered clear of these rote calculations. The loss arising from the employment of an accomplished mathematician, Babbage notes, in performing these the lowest processes of arithmetic results in a kind of double savings in that sense. And so rational management of this type for Babbage consists in applying, in a sense, general principles of analysis to, solving problems of a more general social nature. And I think that based on some of the kind of questions that have come up regarding sort of Neurath's conception of centralized planning and its relationship to knowledge, I think it's interesting. I would think of Babbage's vision as much more of a liberal vision, and it's a sort of sense in which principles of planning and rational management and organization might also be part of a sort of liberal vision of the economy. And so I guess it raises this question of sort of what do we mean when we invoke sort of 19th century liberalism in these kinds of discussions? So as Karl Marx observed, such organization of intellectual work had stripped the bourgeoisie of its halo. It sort of reduces it to this kind of, the same sort of principles that go on in the factory. And as he said, it had reduced the man of science to a paid wage laborer. In the late 19th century, Georg Simmel drew out the broader social implications of the division of labor applied to science. In an 1899 essay published in the Neue Deutsche Rundschau, which he called On the Philosophy of Work, or Zur Philosophie der Arbeit, he built on sort of thinking about how we might imagine sort of intellectual and manual work together within a kind of social order. But he really drew this argument out in his 1900 book, The Philosophy of Money. In The Philosophy of Money, Simmel notes that in the turn of century capitalism, the, quote, needs of the subordinate masses are increasingly satisfied by large enterprises which have engaged countless scientific, technical, and managerial energies in the upper stratus of their service. Simmel understood intellectual work to be the kind of lifeblood of this new economy, and you can imagine Simmel sort of growing up at the very center of Berlin. Sort of, what he sees as the economy being is going to be very much shaped by this kind of urban environment where we have sort of firms coming together, and social historians like Jürgen Koka have sort of demonstrated the kind of importance of intellectual division of labor within sort of factory firms at the time, and sort of, I think this is kind of how we might understand this milieu. And then, as Simmel notes in the case of science, the immense division of labor in science, for instance, results in a situation in which only very few scholars are able to procure for themselves the prerequisites for their work. Innumerable facts and methods have simply to be accepted from the outside as objective materials, as the intellectual property of others that is to be used for further research. Simmel's insight here, I think, is particularly close to what Michael Polanyi would call something like tacit knowledge. Hayek, of course, made use of a similar metaphor in his popular essay, The Uses of Knowledge in Society, that science was no longer performed by individual intellectuals, but is instead organized into a hierarchical system, meant that one had to be initiated into a social order that required taking certain facts or methods for granted. But Polanyi's vision for science, I think the scientific community in particular, differs starkly from this 19th century hierarchical conception of knowledge production that people like Babbage, Marx, and Simmel sort of observe. In fact, for Polanyi, rejected this the possibility of centralized planning in both the economy and science. Polanyi imagines the polity of science more in terms of this liberal vision of non-hierarchical sort of puzzle-solving autonomous savants. Puzzle solvers should work at it independently, he says, as any attempt to organize a group of helpers under a single authority would eliminate their independent initiatives and thus reduce their joint efforts effectiveness to that single person directing from the center. So I think that within that sort of conception, there's obviously room for some forms of organization and hierarchy, but maybe not sort of the very central one that might be sort of in our minds when we think of Neurath's kind of technocratic vision. Whereas 19th century theorists such as Babbage looked to the economy to inform their vision of how to organize knowledge production, Polanyi thought that both the polity of science and the market were guided by the same kind of principle. The polity of science is a kind of coordination of individuals that is, quote, reduced to the mechanism of the market when applied to the production and distribution of material goods. In other words, it is not so much that economic affairs provide a model for the production of knowledge, but rather that the invisible hand coordinates both sort of the market and the polity of science. As Mary Jo Nye observes, the free market language of Polanyi's essay has often been sort of remarked upon, though, and as many of you have sort of demonstrated today, Polanyi's sort of deep immersion in economic theory in many of the circles that we've sort of discussed in terms of the Vienna Circle and others, and his kind of engagement with this work is really significant, I think. And then for Polanyi, the separation of politics, economics, and science provides a kind of protection against both these kind of fascism on the one hand and a kind of maybe leftist Marxist totalitarianism on the other. And then just to sort of conclude my talk, I'd like to kind of think about how this kind of connects up with sort of the history of science studies in STS in the 70s and 80s. So for the post-war generation of science studies scholars, such people as Bruno Latour, Stephen Shapin, Simon Schaffer, and Donna Haraway, the problem was not so much how to avoid a kind of interwar sort of fascism or communism, but instead they saw sort of a particular way of thinking about scientific knowledge and expertise and technocracy as posing a kind of problem for democracy. In that way, their project was more in line maybe with Karl Polanyi's work rather than Michael's. Whereas Michael Polanyi focused on individuals as the autonomous agent in the production of knowledge in the market, these science studies scholars have since focused on the agency of machines, papers, technicians, and others in the making of scientific knowledge. And so in some ways, we kind of go back to the 19th century social theory here. But I'd like to say, sort of coming out of this, that I think that there's some value in sort of not sort of beginning, if we're sort of from a science studies perspective, not sort of beginning our discussion with Polanyi's generation, instead sort of thinking about the longer history of the social studies of science into the 19th century that are sort of deeply connected to questions of the economy in this sort of longer train of thought. And Shapin and Schaffer note in the most recent edition of Leviathan and the Air Pump, which I think was published in 2011, that they look forward to the day when their own work becomes part of history. And so I hope that this brief genealogy provides some ways of thinking about how we might open up a project like that. Thank you.